Pope Jr. leaves the CIA. He's now about 25 years old, and he purchases a newspaper called the New York Enquirer, which was part of the Hearst empire, for about $75,000 using what he described as an interest-free loan for $20,000 as a down payment.
And he was also working for the CIA at the same time?
Well, we don't really know that for sure. Officially, he left the CIA, but there are some reasons to think that he maintained some contact with them. He has kind of a mysterious background, and from what I've read, those who have tried to find government documents on Pope have been blocked for national security reasons. So his true relationship with the government, I don't think has been fully revealed at this time. But at any rate, he somehow managed to come up with some money, quite a bit of money, to buy the Hearst New York Enquirer, and then he later renamed that the National Enquirer, which of course is well known to many people now. The paper that he bought was actually in bad financial shape, and it required kind of a continual infusion of money to keep it afloat. I think the total funds needed to make the newspaper profitable was about $250,000. Now, that may not sound a lot in today's dollars, but if you adjust it for inflation, that's about $1.6 million in 2003 dollars. So it was a big chunk of change for a 25-year-old kid to come up with, and it raises a question, naturally, as to where he got the money. There's been a lot of speculation about that.
And the implication is that he might never officially have left the CIA, that he might have already been doing this as an assignment to get in this newspaper, and that's where the money came from?
Well, that's certainly a possibility, because you have to ask the question, how did somebody that young come up with such a large amount of money? And we know for a fact that in the early 1950s, the CIA was spending very lavishly on a broad range of media assets, as they called them. And it would have been very natural for someone who just came out of the CIA's Psychological Warfare Division to appeal to the CIA for funding, or to at least be qualified to obtain funding for some type of propaganda operation. Some people have said that the funding came from his godfather, who was mobster Frank Costello. Frank Costello was also connected with the OSS during World War II, where he did a lot of things for the intelligence community. So any way you look at it, there are these ties between the National Enquirer and the intelligence community.
And the Mafia.
Yeah, well, the Mafia too, but of course the Mafia and the intelligence community have been working together for many, many years as well, so they're all sort of one big family. But anyway, another connection to the intelligence community is that one of the first employees of the National Enquirer was a man by the name of Bill Bates, and he was a former OSS officer. So you find these consistent ties between the intelligence community and National Enquirer from a very early point in the paper's founding.
And is it fair to say that when you look back at that period of history that you researched, that the Central Intelligence Agency was essentially trying to wire so that they had influence and control on all the major media?
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt about that. And one person commented to me that he thought it was kind of a stretch to believe that they would go to the trouble of funding a newspaper and all this. But actually, it was a fairly common practice for the CIA. And when economist John Kenneth Galbraith went to India as ambassador under John Kennedy, he found a newspaper very much like the National Enquirer in India that he later discovered was financed by the CIA. So it was this type of psychological warfare trick was something the CIA was doing in other parts of the world. It provides some sort of circumstantial support for the theory that the Enquirer was a CIA operation.
If it were, could you now talk about how there seemed to be a concentration on Earth mysteries, specifically UFO stories in the National Enquirer?
People who are familiar with the history of the UFO controversy are probably aware of something called the Robertson Panel. In 1953, the CIA got involved in debunking UFO reports. They put together a panel chaired by a scientist called H.P. Robertson, and Robertson was a very high-level scientific intelligence man. He was a leading physicist as well as an intelligence officer and had played an important role in World War II. So Robertson's recommendation was that, or the recommendation of his panel was that UFOs be debunked by a covert mass media program of training and debunking, as they called it. So this, of course, was about almost the same time that the National Enquirer was getting started. And the National Enquirer, for many years thereafter, was one of the very few national U.S. newspapers to consistently cover the UFO topic. What's interesting about it is that most of their stories were quite accurate. They were sensational by their very nature, but they were quite accurate. Many of them were written by a journalist named Bob Pratt. The stories were true for the most part, but they mixed them in with a kind of this sort of tabloid mix of celebrity stories and trashy, sensationalistic topics, so that anyone who saw these stories in the National Enquirer would make a kind of mental connection between UFOs and rather dubious sensationalistic reporting. And so it cast the whole subject into disrepute. And of course, that's exactly what psychological warfare people do. They use these types of ploys to muddy the waters and confuse people about what's really going on.
Which is exactly the office that Mr. Pope, founder of the National Enquirer, was working in the CIA.
Well, that's right. So it gets even more interesting when you follow the story a little bit further. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, the National Enquirer made sensational UFO-related news coverage sort of a laughingstock, and it kind of set the pattern for other tabloid newspapers to come, which also, I think, had peripheral links to the intelligence community, although it's maybe a little less clear than with the Enquirer. During the 1970s, Pope was having difficulty getting the National Enquirer into the Winn-Dixie grocery store chain, and got help from, of all people, Melvin Laird, who was Nixon's Secretary of Defense. Laird arranged a tour of the White House, the Nixon White House, for Winn-Dixie grocery store executives. They were so impressed with Pope's clout with the White House that they finally agreed to let the Winn-Dixie grocery store chain carry the National Enquirer. In a story about this by Forbes magazine, a reporter asked Pope about this connection he had with the White House and why he had such clout with the national defense establishment and all that. And he said, well, it's just politics. One hand washes the other. The implication, I think, is that Pope was doing something for either the Nixon White House or Secretary of Defense, and that in return they were helping him get his paper out into as many places as possible. So now the final footnote to this whole amazing story is that when Pope died in 1988, he was now one of America's wealthiest men, and who of all people gave the eulogy at his funeral but Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, who had been Defense Secretary under Nixon. So again, you have this interesting tie between the national security establishment and the National Enquirer. So you can kind of connect the dots there, and it looks fairly suspicious, I'd say.
The 2 + 2 = 4, that the National Enquirer was a Central Intelligence Agency psychological warfare project.
Yeah, that's the way it certainly looks to me. The fingerprints are all over it. It's hard to come to any other reasonable conclusion. There's no doubt that the National Enquirer had a huge impact on the way many people in the public at large and also in the journalistic establishment see the UFO topic. I mean, by connecting flying saucers and UFOs with this kind of trashy tabloid reporting, it's made this link in people's minds that UFOs are, by definition, disreputable and questionable material. And, of course, that's exactly what the Robertson panel set out to achieve in 1953. Now, the CIA's official position, I think, is that they never really followed through on the Robertson panel's recommendations, but a letter has come to light through recent research that makes it clear that they were, in fact, doing this sort of thing, because one member of the Robertson panel in 1966 wrote a handwritten letter to a fellow CIA associate in which he confessed that